In 1987, someone hijacked two major television broadcasts in Chicago simultaneously. They did it without being detected. They did it with equipment that should have required a team of engineers and a significant budget to operate. They did it twice in one evening, separated by only a few hours. And they did it wearing a Max Headroom mask, a rubber mask modeled on a fictional AI character from a British television series, moving the mask back and forth in front of the camera in a way that was simultaneously absurd and deeply unsettling, saying things that made no coherent sense. Being spanked by a woman with a fly swatter while moaning, and then disappearing, completely, forever. The hijacker was never identified. The FCC investigated for years. The FBI was involved. Every major broadcast engineer in Chicago was questioned, and nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever publicly named as a suspect. The technical team that pulled it off has remained invisible for nearly 40 years, and the broadcast still exists. You can watch it right now on YouTube. 2.5 minutes of footage that represents one of the most sophisticated and completely unsolved acts of broadcast piracy in the history of American television. To understand why this case is so extraordinary, you need to understand what television signal hijacking actually requires. In 1987, television stations broadcast their signal from a transmitter located at a specific physical site, usually on top of a tall building or tower. The signal traveled from the studio to the transmitter via a microwave link, a directional beam of microwave energy aimed precisely from one point to another. To override a television station's signal, you needed to physically overpower that microwave link with a stronger signal aimed at the same receiver from the same direction. This required a dish antenna of significant size, a transmitter powerful enough to override the existing signal, precise knowledge of the exact frequency and technical specifications of the target station's microwave link, the ability to aim your equipment with enough accuracy to intercept the beam, and a location close enough to the transmission path to make your signal stronger than the legitimate one. This is not something an amateur does in an afternoon. This is something that requires either professional broadcast engineering knowledge or access to someone who has it. It requires equipment that is not cheap and not easy to obtain, and it requires a location that gives you line-of-sight access to the microwave path between the studio and the transmitter. Whoever did this in Chicago on November 22nd, 1987 had all of these things. The first hijacking occurred during the 9 o'clock sports segment on WGN Channel 9, a local news broadcast watched by a significant portion of Chicago on a Sunday evening. The sports anchor was mid-sentence when the signal cut. The screen went to static. Then the Max Headroom figure appeared, bobbing, weaving, the mask moving back and forth, a buzzing, distorted sound accompanying the image. No audio was heard during the WGN hijacking. The figure appeared for approximately 25 seconds. Then WGN engineers managed to override the hijacked signal by switching to a backup transmission frequency, and the regular broadcast resumed. The sports anchor continued as if nothing had happened because there was nothing else to do. WGN management immediately contacted the FCC. An investigation began. Engineers began working to understand how the attack had been executed and whether it could happen again. 2 hours later, it happened again. This time on WTTW Channel 11, PBS, during a broadcast of Doctor Who. The episode was called Horror of Fang Rock. The irony of this was apparently not lost on whoever chose the timing. The Max Headroom figure appeared again, this time with audio. What followed was approximately 90 seconds of footage that broadcast engineers, psychologists, and internet researchers have been analyzing and debating for nearly 4 decades. The figure hummed the theme from the old Clutch Cargo cartoon. It said, "Catch the wave," the advertising slogan of New Coke, while holding a can of Pepsi. It said, "Your love is fading," in a distorted voice. It put on a glove and took it off. It showed what appeared to be a middle finger to the camera. A woman in a French-made costume appeared briefly and spanked the figure with a fly swatter on its exposed buttocks while it moaned. The figure said, "I just made a giant masterpiece for all the greatest world newspaper nerds." Then the signal returned to normal. Doctor Who resumed. The FCC investigation that followed was one of the most intensive broadcast piracy investigations in American history. The technical team assigned to the case included some of the most experienced broadcast engineers in the country. They worked backward from the known technical parameters of both hijacked signals to try to determine where the pirate transmitter had been located. They identified a general area from which the signal must have originated based on line-of-sight requirements and signal strength calculations. They found nothing. No equipment, no abandoned location with evidence of use, no witnesses who had seen unusual antenna equipment being set up or taken down in the relevant areas. Whoever executed the hijacking had set up their their equipment transmitted twice and removed every trace of their presence before investigators could reach the location. The FCC interviewed every broadcast engineer in Chicago who had the technical knowledge to execute an attack of this sophistication. All of them denied involvement. All of them were investigated. None of them were charged. The FBI joined the investigation. Federal charges for broadcast piracy carried significant prison time in 1987, and investigators were treating this as a serious federal crime. The investigation produced no suspects. The case went cold. In 1990, the FCC officially closed the active investigation, having made no progress toward identifying a perpetrator. The case was not solved. It was abandoned, and then the internet arrived. The footage of both hijackings had been recorded by viewers who happened to have VCRs running during the broadcasts. Copies circulated on tape trading networks through the 1990s. When YouTube launched in 2005, the footage was uploaded almost immediately and began accumulating views and comments from people who had never heard of the incident and people who remembered watching it live in Chicago in 1987. A community of amateur investigators formed around the case. Forum threads, Reddit investigations, YouTube analysis videos, Discord servers dedicated to analyzing every frame of the footage and every detail of the technical execution. The amateur investigation produced several significant observations. The Max Headroom mask used in the hijacking was identified as a specific commercial product that had been manufactured in limited quantities for promotional purposes connected to the Max Headroom television series. The number of these masks in existence in 1987 was not large. Tracking who had purchased one in the Chicago area in the relevant period was theorized as a possible investigative avenue. No confirmed result from this approach has ever been publicly announced. The content of the WTTW transmission was analyzed extensively for hidden meaning or coded messages. Several researchers concluded that specific references in the footage pointed toward the Chicago media industry of the late 1980s. References to specific television personalities, specific advertising campaigns, and specific cultural touchstones that would have been recognizable to people working in Chicago broadcasting at the time. This analysis suggested that whoever made the footage had detailed insider knowledge of the Chicago television and media landscape, not someone watching from the outside, someone who was part of the industry or closely connected to it. The technical analysis produced a consensus among experienced broadcast engineers who reviewed the footage that the execution was too clean for a single person working alone. The signal quality during both hijackings was stable enough to suggest that the equipment was properly calibrated and operated by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The timing of the two attacks, 2 hours apart on two different stations using what was presumably the same or similar equipment, suggested either multiple operators or an extraordinarily efficient single operator. In 2010, a television producer named Carolyn Dobbins, who had worked at WGN in 1987, gave an interview in which she discussed the hijacking from the perspective of someone in the studio when it occurred. She described the chaos that followed the loss of signal and the confusion about what had happened. She noted that the people in the studio had no idea what viewers were seeing during the 25 seconds of hijacked signal because they had no way to monitor the outgoing broadcast in real time. The hijacker had chosen their moment well. The 2017 anniversary of the hijacking produced a significant wave of new coverage and new investigation. Multiple journalists and researchers published detailed accounts of the incident. Several broadcast engineers who had been involved in the original investigation spoke publicly for the first time. None of them had new information about the identity of the hijacker. All of them expressed frustration at the failure to identify a perpetrator. One engineer stated that in his professional opinion, the execution of the hijacking represented a level of technical planning and resources that pointed toward either a professional broadcast engineer or a small team with significant technical expertise. He said he had never stopped believing that the person or people responsible were identifiable, that the technical signature of the attack was specific enough that someone in the Chicago broadcast industry in 1987 would have recognized the approach, and that the failure to identify the perpetrator likely reflected either a successful effort to cover tracks or a failure of the investigation to reach the right people with the right questions. In 2023, a Reddit user claimed to have information about the identity of the hijacker. The claim generated significant attention. After investigation by the community, the claim was assessed as unverifiable. The alleged identification was not confirmed by any independent source. The identity of the Max Headroom hijacker or hijackers remains officially unknown. Here's what is certain. On November 22, 1987, someone with sophisticated technical knowledge of broadcast engineering hijacked 2 television signals in Chicago. They created footage in advance that was absurdist, referential, and specific enough to suggest detailed knowledge of Chicago media culture. They executed the technical attack without leaving physical evidence that led to identification. They were investigated by the FCC and the FBI and were never charged. They have maintained complete silence for nearly 40 years, and the footage they created has been watched by millions of people across the world in the decades since.